Welcome to Signs of Life, exploring survival of consciousness. Brought to you by Forever Family Foundation. On the web at foreverfamilyfoundation.org.
I call your name. The echo is haunting. The echo is always the same. I call your name. The echo is haunting. An echo can never be changed. So I call your name. Your name.
And welcome to Signs of Life Radio. I'm your host, Bob Ginsberg, and I'm here with our special guest, Liz Entin. Welcome, Liz.
Hi, Bob.
Right.
Thank you so much for having me.
So Liz Entin is the author of a 2-book series. I'll just call it WTF Just Happened. A sciencey girl explores grief, healing, and evidence of an afterlife. She also hosts a podcast with the same title. She was raised as a logical atheist who knew that consciousness was a function of the brain and an afterlife was just wishful thinking. However, after the death of her father, she took a shot in the dark to see if there was any possible valid evidence of an afterlife. Anything scientific and factual that did not require belief. While she expected nothing, she thought it was at least worth a try. And as she delved into all of the research and evidence, even meeting the people behind it, she ended up down the rabbit hole of the craziest, most worldview-changing journey of her life. And Liz's website is WTFJustHappened.net. Well, this is a switch. I don't know that you've ever been a guest on the show. You're always behind the scenes, right?
I've always been just behind the scenes. Yeah.
All right.
And I probably wouldn't have gone on early because I wouldn't have wanted to tell anyone what happened when I was in my super hide everything stage, which I assume we'll talk about.
Why, no, and I knew it was safe to say, about your father passing because it's in your bio. So, I mean, at the
Yes.
beginning, I know you because you were visiting mediums, you really didn't want to have that out there, and rightfully so. So, really, if you think back before your dad passed, if I knew you then and if I suggested to you that he still existed in some form, what would you have said to me?
I would have been really nice about it. I would have been like, oh, well, thank you. But I would have absolutely not believed it. I would have thought you were either deluding yourself or trying to be nice to me.
Well, that sounds familiar because I would have said the same thing to you.
Yes, I
Come from
figured.
similar backgrounds there. I mean, do you remember, growing up, did you ever discuss the subject of life after physical death with your family or your parents or
Briefly, when I
yeah.
was very little, my parents, especially my dad, had me later in life. So, I'd lost grandparents and they were just like, oh, when I was very little, they go to heaven. And they gave a very childlike version of heaven when I was like 5. Became pretty clear when I got a little older that was a made up thing that you just tell a little child, like the dog went to the farm. And so it was just something we didn't really talk about because I think all of us just kind of were aligned that there was no such thing. And it was really upsetting. Interestingly, I do remember once reading something, maybe when I was about 13, about near-death experiences. I guess there'd been some articles and I asked my mom and she was like, oh, that's interesting. And she's a therapist, did some work with neuroscientists. She was like, oh, I'm sure there's a catch, but let me ask the neuroscientist she works with. And they immediately said, oh, that's complete nonsense. And, that was kind of, you just didn't talk about it because it was too sad. Who wants to talk about it?
So your family really didn't follow any religion, when you were growing up, or did they?
Well, my dad was Jewish. My mom was Protestant. I was raised pretty culturally Jewish. That was a big part of my culture, but not in terms of religion. We celebrated all the holidays, but like when I was little, Christmas, we were told it was Santa Claus, Easter, the Easter Bunny, nothing about anything more than that. And then, for all the Jewish holidays, those were pretty big, but it was also, we read all the prayers that we brought more of the religious aspect into Judaism, and we had zero of Christianity. But, I mean, it was just sort of like, this is our history and our nationality almost, rather than anything to do with the religion. And then, like Passover was getting money if you found the matzah, more than like anything to do with the religion.
There wasn't much depth behind it. Well, the reason I'm curious is because there are so many people, as you know, that they, when you mention the afterlife, they only think of it in religious terms. So, so they would say to you, well, you can't, if you believe in an afterlife, that's because of your religion. But I mean, we know that you could not believe in God and still acknowledge the evidence, of life. So I think that's a mistake that a lot of people make. I mean, because of the religious upbringing, a lot of religions tell you you're going to go here, or you're going to go there based upon the way you live your life. And a lot of the scientists, they, it's interesting to me because I know I once read a survey taken only among scientists, and scientists are taught you only follow the evidence and facts, and then you evaluate it and study the data. So you would think that the survey asked if they believed in God, and so you would think in the scientific community, I would have estimated that maybe 30% did, and it turned out that almost 80% said that they believed in God. So I thought that was a little interesting, especially when I first started researching all this stuff, because they dismiss all of the evidence that, we always talk about, in the near-death experiences, after the communications, reincarnation, and everything else. But yet they never got any proof of, that God exists, and yet it's their faith, so it's like a bit of a hypocrisy in the scientific community, I'm sure
That's so interesting. Yeah, I hadn't heard that about God. I mean, I still actually don't think there's a God, but it's interesting because I kind of think it's the wrong question. I think has nothing to do with, is there a God or not? Is consciousness created by a brain, or is it downloaded by a brain and hosted somewhere else, like the cloud? I mean, the God's just, that's getting into major philosophy. I mean, maybe there's some form of higher consciousness. Who knows? I mean, I wouldn't align it with any type of God that's ever been defined by a religion, but that's getting into something we can't have evidence for.
You're open to the possibility, right? I mean, you're an open-minded skeptic, right? So
yes, after everything I've learned, I guess I need to be pretty open-minded that things are just really different than you would think. But I wouldn't think it's the most likely answer. I would lean a little more towards biocentrism, that, we're sort of collective consciousness creating stuff together rather than one supreme being that created it all.
Right. So once you started going down this rabbit hole and learning and exploring and talking to people, I imagine, judging from my own experience, that you were a bit surprised at what you were learning. I mean, I used to say, wow, I mean, why doesn't everybody know about this? And nobody knew about it. So, I mean, was there surprise when you started learning about the evidence?
Oh, I mean, that's an understatement. I think it was the most shocked I've ever been. But then also, it was a type of shock where I was like, no way, this cannot be true. There's a catch. And so for a very long time, until maybe last year, I finally given up that there's a catch. I still have my fears that things aren't, not that all of this isn't true, but that physics will come up with an explanation and the answer is not individualist survival. But yeah, early on, I would say, there's a quote, and I'm going to butcher it, but it's the concept. It's by Dean Radin, and it sums up my experience with all this. It's like when you first start hearing all this and first learn about it, I believe it was about quantum entanglement, but he was kind of using it to apply to survival and all this research in general. It's like going down a roller coaster, your stomach, and it's the most profound thing you've ever heard. And the further you go with it, profound doesn't even come close to describing what you're feeling. And I think it was just this complete shock, joy, and a terror that I was going to find the catch.
So it was only last year that you relented? That's a long
Yeah,
time.
but probably,
I think
probably.
longer than me, I think.
You're 7 years, I remember. I
Uh,
think I beat you by a year. I was 8 years.
yeah. So, as you're learning
Mhm.
about all this stuff, did you have any kind of non-physical experiences like after death communications or anything like that?
Did. So I started all of it just reading the data. That was, I wasn't trying to have experiences. I didn't think it was an option. So it started with finding all the data. First, Dr. Jim Tucker and reading everything. And then few weird things started to happen. The very first, I'd say, was going to a medium. And then I saw my dad in my room, and I was so excited. I jumped and I was ready. I would have said something, and then he went away. And then
Were you afraid when that happened? Was there
no,
no
I was
fear?
shocked. I was thrilled and I wanted to
Yeah.
talk to him. I was going to ask him for,
Yeah.
it was just like joy and
Yeah.
shock. And, I wanted to ask him, tell me something that mom knows that I don't, so I can know this is real. And then he went away.
Oh,
And yeah,
that,
yeah. So
why do you think he went away? You think he was just showing up to say hello and let you know that he's there?
I mean, it's hard to know. If I
Yeah.
could guess, this is really, really hard to do. And he probably built up, who knows how much energy and did it, and could only
Right.
stay for so long. It seems it's some way of like pressing into another dimension that's just really, really hard. Just
Right.
probably the way, like, if we could give a physical description, like hold your breath for so long or hold a pull up for so long, you do it as long as you can.
Yeah.
And
Or on the other hand, he didn't go away. He was right there, but you
Mhm.
lost the connection, the ability to perceive him. We always think of it in
Mhm.
terms of them, manifesting, all their energy to do it. But maybe it's not that way. Maybe they're just there and it's really us. Some people, it's hard for us to maintain, the connection. So I'm open to that possibility as well. Um,
Yeah, maybe a combination. Yeah,
yeah.
but those were my very first two experiences, but I have some more I can share, including ones you were there for. So
Well, go ahead. So share another one.
I'd say this was the reason I always like to share this, as
Yeah.
as well as having gotten a sign or two. This one, I think, because it was, sort of a turning point where I was able to take everything in at the next level. Still skeptical, but able to process it with more understanding. And it was actually at the first retreat I went to for Forever Family in 2016, the Afterlife and Mediumship convention. And Bob actually made a joke, and said, Liz, why don't you try to give a medium reading? And all the mediums at that point were in a row behind a table, and attendees who were there on the track to develop their abilities were giving them readings. I was on the track for grief, and I had just finished a class I'd been taking at the Rhine with Lloyd Arbach on cold reading. So I thought it'd be fun and light to get up and give some cold readings. And it was just meant to be a joke, instigated by Bob, and it was fun. And I started off that way. I went to, the only medium I knew at the time, and I knew some stuff about her. That was Laura. I'd read her book and had met her a few times, and it was always a little awkward because I sat there and refused to tell her anything about myself. As I even developed some friendships with mediums at that retreat that I would sit and just be like, I can't tell you anything. So, I was at that kind of stage in my life. And I started to say some stuff from her book, and then I started to feel really weird. It was like I was trying to logically think of stuff from her book that were not personal or about a loss. I just want to find light things because, I'm not going to take personal things about another person and, make a game. So, and I really can't say what happened next. I was just feeling all these waves moving through me, and I just kind of thought, oh, it's brain neurons healing because there's so much healing about grief. And I can't say why. I walked over to Joe Shield, and I just felt like I didn't know him at all at the time. We've since become friendly, and I felt all these waves moving through me, and they were doing weird things. Like they were building up in my heart then and bursting. And I was like, did you lose someone from a heart attack? Yes. then they went to my brain and were built up and burst, built up and burst. So I was like, brain tumor? I was like, no, the way they're bursting, aneurysm. He's like, yes. And I was just like, what? I won't quote what I said, but I was like, what is going on? And looked to you, of course, to see if you'd set this up as a joke with them, and realized I hadn't and you had not. And that was just one of the most profound.
You really thought I set it up,
life-changing.
huh?
I thought it's possible. I
Okay.
remember it was like maybe Bob thought this was a great prank, but
Yeah.
you could kind of tell the energy of like the seriousness of like
Yeah.
Joe O'Sheil. I mean, he, you know, that
Right.
he would not do that to me.
Right.
So
All right. So you got to feel for that moment what it's like to be a
Mhm.
medium. Yeah.
I did.
Yeah.
And that changed a lot for me.
Yeah. So, I mean, obviously, I know that you've seen a lot of mediums over the years. I think you mentioned you've probably seen about 50 or
More.
More.
Well, if you count, you know what? I have some friends that are mediums and they'll
Yeah.
teach mediums and they'll say, Liz, can you be a sitter for them? And like,
Yeah.
don't be the harshest sitter you can be somewhat in between, but and give them feedback. And so
Yeah.
if you include that, my own, maybe about closer to 100, but I
Okay.
feel like I might be getting made fun of a little for that. So
Well, all right. Well, it is what it is. I mean, you did that,
Yes.
really out of curiosity, but so you
Research,
know
yeah.
that, like in my book, I said that
Mhm.
I thought that 85 to 90% of the practicing mediums couldn't do what they claim. As somebody that had seen a very large number of mediums, what do you think about that? What kind of percentage would you think that of mediums, can really do it?
I would agree with you. I mean, I think the readings I have gotten, again, a large percent have been like in classes helping people. So that
Yeah.
really skews the amount I've had. And they're pretty new. So I'd say a lot of them, at this point,
Yeah.
not as evidential, but it's a little skewed because I go to Forever Family Foundation mediums,
Right.
Winbridge, the
Right.
Arthur Finley. So but I would say I overall agree. And I do not think all of them are intentionally being, I don't think most of them are cheating. I think a large majority maybe are really connecting or can connect to an extent, but they're not able to get evidence to prove beyond a reasonable doubt that they are either communicating with your deceased loved one or that the laws of physics are different than materialism.
Yeah, I think where a lot of mediums get into trouble is they get the pure information, but they interpret it wrong, instead of just saying what they're getting and let the sitter do the interpretation, they're trying to put it into their own, symbols and frames of reference. And that's why, some of the classically trained mediums that taught just give what you got, yeah, basically. So, I think that happens, but so if I were to ask you, what do you think is more powerful? You may not be typical when I ask this question. What's more powerful in coming to believe in life after death? Personal experiences or learning about the scientific evidence?
Well, first of all, I'm going to challenge you on the word believe. I don't like the word believe. I think it's a preponderance of evidence or beyond a reasonable doubt, because belief, I don't resonate with that word. For me, it's the science, I think it's a combination.
Why did I know you were going to say that?
Yeah.
Well, I've told you this before, but many years ago, we did a survey, and it was a one-question survey, and I asked people, given the choice, would they rather communicate with their deceased loved one directly or through the services of a medium? And when I asked that question, I was sure that the majority was going to say directly, because that's what I would have said. But it was the opposite. And most people said through the services of a medium. And then I had to start probing why. And there were two factors. One, there's still that fear factor associated with things beyond the known senses. You know, it's
Mhm.
based on media and cultural influences and societal influences and so forth. So people thought it would be spooky, you know, to get
Mm.
information. But the real reason was that people said that if they got it directly, they would question whether or not they were making it up or was their imagination or their grief talking. Whereas if they got it through the services of an expert, a qualified medium, then they could trust the information. That made sense to me, right? But
Yeah,
but I still think a lot of, hey, listen, if you saw your father, right?
I did. I
And that
did.
didn't move you to that knowing stage, even though you saw him.
Oh, not at
So,
all. I
no,
mean, I can picture him in my head right now anytime I want. So why would that not just be my brain neurons conjuring him up in the middle of deep grief? But I
no,
would prefer to communicate myself versus a medium, given I got evidence. If it was EVP and he said something again that my mom knew that I didn't know.
right.
Because if it was just EVP without that, how do I know it's not my own PK, which is still consciousness behaving non-physically, but also how do I know I didn't say it in a voice unconsciously in a trance state?
Yeah.
Um,
And
yeah.
folks, this is coming from a person. I'll tell this story again. But when Liz started out on this journey, she had to send in a physical registration form and setting up a reading with a medium.
Mhm.
So Liz, you know, she was going to use I assume, you know, like a phony name and so forth. But
Of course.
she went to the trouble of wearing gloves. And if you ask her why, it's because she wanted to eliminate the possibility of the medium lifting her fingerprint from the paper and then running it through a database and then finding out who she was. That's about the most extreme I've ever heard. But you know, you are a sciencey girl, so that was the way you were
Yes,
thinking.
yes,
Yeah.
yes, yes. That was,
I
there were
mean,
two
in
mediums
retrospect,
I did
you
that
do think that
too.
was a little bit extreme, don't you?
Not
No.
at all. No, I think it was smart because if a medium had, let's say, a contact to the CIA or FBI, I used to wonder if that was what made the top mediums the top mediums. They just had really good CIA contacts. So it actually, I mean, I think it's logical. I would still tell someone to do that because they have that contact. I'm the only one supposedly who touched the paper. Um, and then they would run it through. So it should only have one set of fingerprints. That would be mine. They have a brother and husband, whatever, in the CIA. There you go. You have everything on me.
Does paper hold a fingerprint? I don't even know.
Oh, I don't know. I wasn't going to take the risk.
All right.
Probably. I mean, you hear of
So
detectives solving crimes through
yeah.
fingerprints, so maybe.
So in your books and you know, personally, you know, from personal
Mhm.
experiences, you're interested in grief. And so what do you think of the classical five stages of grief?
Um, I don't resonate with it at all. I think, I mean, I'm not like, oh, it's 100% off, makes no sense whatsoever. I think it's sort of just a general, very, very general, broad model. And you can just be like, oh, I kind of have felt that. I can relate to that. I think it's a way maybe to make it a little universal. And there's something nice about not having it so lonely, but I don't relate to that. I think it's very individual. And you can even two people who could have had the same loss or lost the same person, or two, you know, two people who had the same loss, like siblings who both lost a parent. You know, my mom and I both having lost my dad, we handled it very, very differently, and emotions are very different. So I think when you try to say grief is linear, or they try to say this is how grief's supposed to be, it can kind of mess you up because you're like, but wait, that's not it for me. Or that
Yeah.
after a year, you'll feel better. I remember kind of waiting for that turning point. I'm like, oh, I actually feel worse because like some of the numbness is gone. And that was
Yeah.
hard.
Well, I agree with you. And even
Yeah.
Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, you know, at the end, you know, kind of
Hmm.
backed off that, you know,
Hmm.
that whole concept. I also think it's a mistake turn it into some sort of a linear timeline. You're in stage one, you're in stage two. Anybody that's in grief, you have all those emotions all at once sometimes. You have the anger, you have the guilt, you have the. So it never resonated with me either. So did you ever give any thought of what it would take for you, just for you, to remove all doubt, and not quite, no more open-minded skepticism, just absolutely convinced, all knowing that there's an afterlife? What would it take for Liz for that?
Oof. Well, I will say one of two things. Logically, I will say a near-death experience, because that seems to be what happens to the majority, 99.9% of the people.
Yeah.
But me sitting here as Liz now, I'd say, well, how do I know that wasn't a hallucination of a dying brain? So most likely, probably after I die. Although I believe it was Joe Peretta, if you're listening, said to me, no, because right after I die, I'm probably going to be a nightmare and be like, oh, how do I know I'm actually dead and I'm not in hospice making all this up? And he's like, you're just going to follow us all around and drive us crazy for like years, because, time's different. Years is probably like 3 days here, and just the whole time be like, but wait, this just happened. So maybe I am really dead and not imagining all of you while in hospice. So
So what you're telling me is that even when you die and you wake up and you're still alive, you're still not going to be fully convinced.
Probably for a long time.
Okay, that's a different
my guess. That's my guess.
So, as you know, like mediumship research has been going on for many decades, and
yes.
It's all taken the same path. Mediums are studied, and the evidence that they provide noted and then scored, and the numbers are crunched, and and then the conclusion among the consensus on most of these studies is that some people can communicate with discarnate entities without deception or fraud. So we've done that. I think that's kind of run its course. I don't know if there's anything more to be gained by continuing that type of research, but what kind of research do you think is next in mediumship research? And I know I see the smile, so I know maybe I know
what I'm going to say. I think you know what I'm going to say. And it's a research I'm I don't think it's like next year. First of all, I will just say, I don't think the other has run its course. I think we need to keep doing it because it's such a preponderance of evidence needed. Extraordinary. I know people hate this line, but I still stand by it. Extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. I think it's something so astounding. We need to keep just non-stop gathering evidence for it. But next, well, one thing I absolutely am obsessed with is there's something now, it's still early stage, but lab grown brains. And I think once I can see so many experiments we can do with that. I mean, we'll get so much more insight into brains, brain waves. We can do stuff such as, well, I think neuroscience in general, hooking up more and more mediums' brains as we get better and better at that. And then I see many ways we can also incorporate lab-grown brains as they get stronger and stronger, and possibly AI into this. But I'm not as clear yet how we could use AI, because I think that could so clearly mimic consciousness that I'm not sure to what extent any experiment would be valid.
Yeah. Well, I think that, all the brain mapping that's going on and measuring the regions of the brain when somebody's engaged in meditation or a mediumship or psychic ability is interesting, because if we can isolate certain areas of the brain that facilitate such communication, we can all maybe eventually do it ourselves, so I think that that has potential. That may be the way the most beneficial type of research that can be done. Lab grown, I got to think that that's going to be after I'm gone. I don't see that
It's gonna
happening.
be after probably my grandkids will be gone. It's gonna be a long time.
Yeah.
But what I like about it is it's a brain not attached to a personality and an individuality. So I think we can explore a lot with that. Can you send a personality to it? Can you send information to it? And, because there's also theories that even us ourselves are essentially on the other side. And when we come here, we're still on the other side, but a large percent of our consciousness is attached to a physical individuality. And if you eliminate that, when someone passes away and then they're fully on the other side, or maybe other dimensions we don't know about, and then they can communicate with mediums. We do our best to communicate with our loved ones ourselves. And then, yeah, so if you have the mechanism of something that downloads consciousness, but it's not downloading a specific consciousness. That's why I'm absolutely obsessed with lab grown brains when we get them far enough, because I think that'll be something we can really play with.
Well, I'm open to everything. So, I mean, that's a possibility.
Yeah.
I'd be curious to see if a lab-grown brain can engage in psychokinesis, mind affecting matter, so that would be interesting. Yeah.
Same.
We are talking with Liz Entin. She's the author of WTF Just Happened. If you have a question for Liz, you're welcome to call in. The number is 888-627-6008. So you're a lot younger than I am, so I'll ask you this question. Do you think that the younger generations are more or less open to the possibility of life after physical death?
More, I feel, overall. Well, it's interesting. I'm see that it seems like my generation, millennial, and then, was it Z below us? I feel like everyone I've spoken to in my generation are much, much more open when I tentatively have quote unquote, come out of the closet about my books, podcasts, and they're all like, oh, that's fascinating. Or I've been to a medium, I've been to an astrologer. And, my parents' generation, like my parents' friends overall tend to think I'm nuts about this. And they were never open to this stuff. However, not in the culture I was in. There seems to be more organized religion that older generations follow.
Right.
And they seem to ascribe an afterlife to that. But I feel my generation, of the people who don't align with religion, including atheists, they're much, much more open to all of this.
Well, then again, you might say your circle of friends, they all know what
Right.
you do. So they're going to be supportive, I mean, what about, I mean, do you have friends that you've never ever discussed this topic with?
No, I mean, it's such a big part of my life
Yeah.
that no, but like, I guess because I'm pretty social, I go to events and new things.
Yeah.
I guess actually I'll say the friends that aren't interested in it at all, and
Yeah.
they just don't especially want to talk about it. And I can understand that. If you haven't had a loss, you often don't want to talk about death at all.
Yeah.
But I'd say, when I meet new people at social events, it's not always the thing I lead with, to say the least, but
Yeah.
I'll
It's not
learn
exactly
getting-
something you'd lead on a first date with, like.
No, not at all. Although it has come up on dates, like people have Googled me and I'm like, oh God, do you still want to go on the date? And they're like, yeah, you speak about it really rationally. I'm like, okay, thank you. But I think, there's a lot of people, and I say this, and they're like, a lot of, oh, I've been to a medium, I go to an astrologer, I'm totally into this. And once in a while too, and this is also, I've noticed maybe with a little bit older people, they're more secret about it. And they'll often say, I know we've discussed this, but I've never told anyone this, but, and then the craziest, most evidential story will come out of their mouths.
Right. So how do you handle it, like in social situations where you meet somebody for the first time and the subject, you're debating whether or not to bring up the subject, but do you sort of feel them out? I mean, I do that, I try to, just go by my gut to say, if I say something about this, they're not going to react well, and then somebody you just feel like they will. Do you find similar situations like that?
I have my language for how I first speak about it. I'm not like, yeah, I have books and podcasts about afterlife and I've gone to like 100 mediums. I mean, that's not how I lead it. I
Yeah.
say, one of my jobs is books and podcasts on science and spirituality and neuroscience tied into spirituality. And if they seem interested in going a little further, I'll be like, yeah, and some stuff related to like the possibility of life after death, really, and then I'll always say like, I had a loss in my family. So people, because in that case, at least they're not like, oh, she's crazy. They're like, okay, there's a logical reason. And, I go more from, again, that's step 2. I only go to depending how they respond. And then if they respond more to that, then I'll talk further. But, my leading conversation is more about,
Yeah.
kind of a mixture of science and spirituality. And if there's like science behind spiritual stuff. So.
Yeah. Yeah, I understand. Well,
Yeah.
the reason I was curious about the generations is that, especially the younger generation relies on AI and the internet so much. Like I worry about it's sort of suppressing independent thought because you could find out the answer to anything by just typing in a few things. So if they're curious about the afterlife and they go to Chat GPT or whatever, then they get some standard stuff. But your experience is kind of the opposite. Most people are young people, or as you said, are more open to this than people, let's say, in my generation. So
Yeah, but again, that's a skewed perspective because most of the people I know in your generation are,
don't say you're
parents.
dead.
Yeah, I was about to say that. No, I was about to say are my parents' friends, which is the culture I grew up in. And
Right. Yeah.
yeah.
So
Or I meet them at Forever Family, and that's obviously a very different, or like Ians, and those are very different perspectives, obviously. So
obviously, it's preaching to
yeah.
the choir.
Yeah.
So over so you've, as I have, you've discovered or studied all of these different disciplines of research, and so out of everything, if you had to name one area of research that you think is the most compelling, what would it be?
I can't answer that way. I'm going to give the answer that most people seem to give. And it's actually, I consider it evidential that most skeptics say the same thing. One individual body of research you can always dismiss or say it's skewed or there's a fluke under this. It's when it all comes together and consciousness seems to behave non-locally and, like outside of a brain in so many areas. And when you put that all together and combine it with like quantum physics, where information, like, quantum entanglement, where information is transferred faster than the speed of light by a mechanism we don't understand. Kids have past life memories where consciousness seems to be stored in some mechanism we don't understand. Same with mediumship, near-death experiences, things not directly related to an afterlife, like remote viewing. It's really when you put it all together that
Yeah.
it becomes incredibly compelling.
Yeah, I mean, I always thought that the near-death experience, phenomenon it was the most evidential. But what you said, like Bruce Grayson said at one of our conferences, that it's easy to dismiss, one particular area of research, although we can refute most of the things that they dismiss it over. But he said, but when you step back and you take it all in, the explanation that makes the most logical sense is that we survive physical death, so it's
Yeah.
true. I mean, that's essentially what you were saying. So after all this, if I were to ask you, is the Liz today more or less fearful about dying?
Oh my God, less. I don't fear it at all anymore. Not in the big intellectual picture. My physiological body still responds the same, like during turbulence. I still panic. I have to text Joe Peretta for an okay before I get on any plane. Thank you, Joe. I physiologically, I respond the same as I always have in the moment of,
Well, you are
that
human.
survival instinct.
Yeah.
Yeah. But I don't fear it at all anymore. I fear my loved ones dying and the loneliness and sadness of that. I fear not accomplishing everything I'm hoping to accomplish in this life.
Yeah.
But I have no fear of death. I'm kind of like, oh, I'm kind of excited. I mean, I have a small fear, but overall,
Yeah.
no.
Well, did you used to fear death, like
Oh
before all
my
this?
God, like
Yeah.
profoundly haunted and terrified.
Right.
I couldn't even think about it. It just like haunted me in the most, like so much worse than I even realized, because I didn't really have a comparison. But now having this comparison, I just see even that it haunted me even more than I knew. It
Yeah.
was horrible. It was like this existential dread that never went away.
Yeah. It's much like myself. I had most of my childhood and adolescence.
Mhm.
I terribly upset over it. I just couldn't
Mhm.
imagine being extinguished forever. It was like, didn't make any sense to me. Like, what's the purpose?
Yeah.
Whatever. And also, like you, after all this, um, yeah, I'm a bit excited. I wouldn't do
Yeah.
anything to
Yeah.
hasten my death, but I don't fear it at all. What I fear
Exactly.
is
Same.
the actual uh, process of dying and the possible
Yes.
pain and suffering that goes along with it, but
I agree.
not the dying itself.
I
Um,
agree. Yeah,
yeah.
yeah. I hope it's not painful, and I'll do what I can to make it not. But yeah, and I fear like my survival instincts coming in and making psychological sort of torture, even if all my intellect is not afraid to die.
And well, I mean, along the way, when you were seeing all the mediums and your grief was still profound, when you got a strong evidential reading from a medium, um, how did that make you feel?
Oh my God, it felt amazing. Shocked, joyful. The grief would alleviate for a bit. Not completely. Actually, that's something I do want to say is I used to think there'd be this level of evidence I would hit and I would never feel grief again. And that's absolutely not true. And that's
Right.
something that I just want anyone who's skeptical, who's like pushing for that level of evidence, thinking it'll cure and completely eliminate grief. That's not possible, no matter how much I think it's probable now. Grief's just part of life. And I've since
Right.
lost other people and animals since my dad. But in that moment and for a while after, it would be like this high. It was just like partially grief related, and partially I think it's just some of the most scientifically fascinating phenomena we have access to.
Yeah.
So intellectually, it was just, my intellect, I'm kind of emotionally tied into. It's not like a dry intellect. So seeing what I would consider like the most fascinating science by far that I personally have access to, so.
And what happened when you went to a medium and you got a crappy reading? How'd that make you feel?
Multiple ways. Very early on, it was devastating. But then I would step back and it was like, okay, well, it's showing me that I'm a sitter that's capable of assessing. And that, because if I think this one's horrible and I thought those other two were amazing, it's not just me. Excuse me. It's not just me making things fit, which is also, I think, recording and scoring after is important. But I think it was that. And then a few times, just as a fluke, like there was one or two Forever Family ones that were not good. They offered to do it again later. They handled it perfectly ethically, but I almost feel that might have been meant to be that way because that proved, like I wondered in the beginning, as Forever Family got my real name, were mediums making a file on me? And but to not see each reading get progressively better was really good. But there were early on too where not Forever Family mediums, but I had a couple mediums that were not good early on. And I think my second reading was the worst reading I ever had of like a quote unquote genuine medium. Like I have gone to like one of those like $300 candle palm reader ones just to test them. And that was the worst. And
Yes.
she was as bad as that. And that was my second reading. And that was devastating for me.
Yeah.
So,
So tell us a little bit about your books. Why'd you write them, and what, let's talk a little bit about the content, so people can get a flavor for it.
sure. So my first book is WTF Just Happened, A Sciencey Skeptic Investigates Grief, Healing, and Evidence of an Afterlife. My second book, WTF Just Happened, A Sciencey Skeptic Investigates Even More Evidence of an Afterlife and Fights for Justice with Her Dead Dog. Those are my two books. I wrote them, you know what? It just sort of happened so naturally because, I was in year one, I was in year two, and I was just feeling horrible in different ways. But I noticed I would just be like, I feel so shocked after any forms of evidence. And I also saw a lot of humor in it. Like, I was really awkward. I would go to medium events and be just like such a pain in the butt. I was like,
You come on.
no, never, never.
Yeah.
And just like, because I was such a pain, like ridiculous things would happen. And I was like, I can see the humor in that. And so I would just like blog for myself and it would cheer me up. So then I was like, and I want to remember this. And then I was just writing it. And then I was like, I'll do a blog. And I put up as a blog. I had like 2 readers, my mom and like a friend, and I wasn't expecting anything of it, but it just got more and more. I was like, oh, I'm going to do a book. And I had it like all written. I was like, I'm not going to publish it. And then Fran gave me a little bit of a kick in the butt through Medium to get going on it. And I was like, yeah, I got to do it. And I was like, I'm scared because people are going to think I'm insane if I quote unquote come out with this. And then I had my podcast, and it just happened so organically. And then part of it's also making meaning. Like, I lost my dad younger than the average person. And like, it just came from so many. That was another big angle. It was, so many angles. And then I just sort of was like, dove in and did it and was like, oh God, I'm about to lose every like job I ever apply for in the future. Let's see what happens. Never get another date, never get married. People are gonna think I'm a, lunatic, but just did it. I don't know.
Well, the good thing is that you've seen the progression where this subject matter has become more mainstream than it was 20 years ago, whatever.
Yeah.
So people find your podcast on the website.
Yeah, my podcast is WTF Just Happened, all about the afterlife, no woo. It's on all podcast apps. Yeah, and then my 2 books follow my story from 2015 when my dad first got sick to like a bit of grief and dealing with my whole story of gathering more and more evidence. And it goes through 2018, I think. And my second book is 2018 through 2021. I'm working on a third that's going to be 2021 to like today.
Okay. So, yours is a continuing, story. You would think like in some books, it goes from, not believing at all in the afterlife. And then it ends with, total 100% belief. Yours is just a continuing rabbit hole, right?
Yes.
You gather momentum along the way and you move the needle a bit, but you're not quite all the way at 100%. Yeah.
No. But I mean, you can bring in so many things. That gets very philosophical, but how do I know we're not just in a simulation right now and I'm only here for 10 minutes and it's, they implanted all these memories. I mean, we can get into philosophy. I mean, you can't really know anything 100%.
Hey, also when I was a strange kid as well, and I know it's hard for you to believe, but I used to think that at one time I was the only real person, living person, and everybody else were actors. Like my parents were just better actors than everybody else. Like they auditioned for the job, and my brother, it's like that's a pretty sick thought for a 6-year-old, but that's the way it was.
Oh wow, that was young. I didn't get those thoughts till I was a little older, but I used to wonder, like, what if everyone's my imagination? What if just 10 of us are real? What if, and we really don't know that, I mean, get a little more complex.
Did you find along the way that the more science, the more evidence you learned about, that opened you up to receiving after death communication because there was science behind it. So you gave yourself permission to, to open up and recognize these things.
100%. Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. Like, I mean, something like a sign, I heard a scientist actually first speak about them. If I had not heard that, I I mean, it wasn't even be something on my radar. And then, as I read more and more science about it and started to hear more signs, then I was able to see them, in ways. And I mean, I demand like strong signs. I'm not just like, oh, there's like a rainbow today. Not to knock if anyone's gotten a rainbow, but you know what I mean? I mean,
I know.
like, I hope that didn't, I don't want to like take away from anyone's signs,
Yeah.
but I mean, I demanded some pretty intense signs. So,
Yeah. Yeah. Well, it's like everything else. There's real, and then then there are
Mhm.
explanations. I mean, I'm one that I totally respect, the signs, and I appreciate it,
Mhm.
like when they come, but I don't think that every coin that I find in the street is a sign, I mean, it
Exactly.
just, some people drop coins and they don't pick them up, but on the other hand, sometimes they're very synchronistic. If you're thinking of your loved one
Mhm.
or you make a request, send me a dime today, and then you find a dime and you pick it up and it's the date is their birth year, then it takes on a
Yeah.
little, and we always say that, people say, well, how do you recognize a sign? I always tell them, well, the true signs come attached to a knowing. Like when they happen, there's no doubt in your mind, that's coming from your loved one,
Mm.
and that's how I determine it.
Okay.
Have you ever had any dream visitations?
I have. Yeah, I've had some amazing signs and amazing dream visitations. I'd say I've had quite a few dreams of my dad. I never know if 100% they're visitations. I'd say two really strong visitations that were evidence that I got verified. I had a dream about my cat. It was like half dream. I was in the hypnagogic state. So I knew I was like kind of dreaming, but she was there and she was really strong. And I said to her, like, Simba, I love you. I love you so much. I really feel you here. But if this is really you, I need more than this. And I woke up to a message from a medium that said, do you have a cat? Described my cat and said the cat came to her in a dream that night. And then I sent her a photo and she's like, oh, kind of like that cat, maybe a little bigger or chubbier. And I sent her I sent her a photo then of when the cat was much younger. And she said that was the exact cat. And it's a medium I trust, they're not going to
Yeah.
lie. So
Yeah.
that was verified. And then, yeah, that was, I'd say, one of my dreams that
Yeah.
really stood out. And then I'll have very strong dreams I remember very well about like my dad, other people, animals. So not often, but
In any of those dreams with your dad, were you able to communicate with him, or was it just he was just there?
we communicated. And
Oh,
in one, I thought this was pretty interesting. I was like at an event, I think a friend's wedding, and we were getting ready in a room, and it was a big hotel where there were so many voices outside the door. My dad was one of the voices, and he's like, I'm trying to talk to you through this door. And it was like I was trying to hear him among all the voices. I thought that was, and it was like I remembered it perfectly. And I tend to not always remember my dreams unless I'm keeping dream journals regularly. And it was like one of those very clear, remembered it perfectly, remember it to this day. So I thought that was an interesting one because he was like, I'm really trying to talk to you through this door. And I was like, I'm trying to listen. There's so many voices.
yeah, that is
So
cool.
yeah, that was very cool.
Yeah. So we have been talking with Liz Entin. So if you want to read more about all this stuff, and on your website, you have some of the things we've been talking about. You talk about grief, you talk about, some of the science.
Yeah.
So, interesting articles. It's WTFJustHappened.net. The two books, I assume they could purchase the books via your website, right?
Yes, they can either
And
buy them directly from me
yeah,
or through all the book places.
right. Anything else you want to tell us before we say goodbye?
Yeah, I have some journals. The audiobook for book two will probably be a few more months, so have patience with that. And yeah, I guess just one thing that really helps me to this day is I used to always think that, you know, it was just kind of known and logical that consciousness was created by a brain. But when you start to think about it, like, you know, it makes absolutely no sense how consciousness could be not created by a brain and downloaded by it. It makes just as little sense that consciousness could be created by a brain. Because, like, how does mass and matter create this complex consciousness that's like love and emotions and personality? Both equally make absolutely no sense. And they're both too weird. And so when I think about that, that helps me a lot. And there's a lot more evidence for one than the other, which is that consciousness is downloaded by a brain and continues. So that's, I'd say, something that really keeps me going on some of my griefier days.
Well said. And all the phenomena that we study that shows that the mind or the consciousness can act independently of the physical brain, it lays the groundwork for believing in life after death, because that's the only way we could survive, is if, the brain is no more and we still go on. So thanks for being here. We'll talk to you again soon. Again, the website is WTFJustHappened.net, and we'll say goodbye and we'll say goodnight to everyone. Good night.
Thank you so much.